Good day. Today is Monday, 2nd June 2025, and I am in my hotel room in Tbilisi, in Georgia, and obviously today being the first day, my schedule is particularly tight. So my program today is going to be shorter than other programs, which I expect I will be able to make whilst I'm here in Georgia. Anyway, the first thing to say is that though I am in Georgia, it is for the first time, and I have only been here for a few hours, so I'm not yet able to provide you with any thoughts or comments about the country itself, other than what I saw of it through my taxi window, which is that it was very beautiful. So I'm going to go straight in and I'm going to discuss the big news of the last 24 hours, which was the various drone strikes that Ukraine carried out against various Russian air bases over the course of the previous 24 hours, together with the latest diplomatic moves leading to the meeting which is going to take place today in Istanbul, apparently not in the Dolmabahce Palace, but in another palace in Istanbul. Istanbul, by the way, has many, many palaces, but the next meeting that will take place between the Russian and Ukrainian delegations. And I should say that late yesterday, President Zelensky confirmed that Ukraine would indeed send a delegation to Istanbul. It will again be led by Ukraine's defense minister, Mr. Umerov, and he will be meeting the same Russian delegation that the Ukrainians met during the meeting on the 16th of May, and that Russian delegation is led by the Russian chief negotiator, Vladimir Medinsky. And, well, I'll return to the events such as they are that are taking place on the diplomatic front. But I think the first thing to do is to discuss the drone strikes. So there were apparently 5 drone strikes on Russian military bases across Russia. And these were the bases of Russian strategic aviation. That is to say, the branch of the Russian Air Force that has the heavy bombers, the Tupolev 95s and the Tupolev 22 M3s and the Tu-160s, the big bombers that form a part of Russia's strategic triad. And these are the same bombers that regularly launch cruise missiles at Ukraine, the Kh-101 subsonic cruise missiles to be precise, though the arguably more powerful Kinzhal hypersonic missiles are launched by entirely different aircraft that do not form part of Russia's strategic bomber, strategic aviation. They're the MiG-31s, which are assigned to a different branch of the Russian Air Force. I'm not going to go into the details of the various branches of the Russian military. I think that would be more complicated, and I would be discussing things that are beyond my own knowledge. Anyway, the Russians have provided their own account of this drone attack, and the Ukrainians have provided very, very detailed accounts of this drone attack. And it seems, as I said, that 5 different Russian air bases were attacked, and that these attacks took place right across Russian territory, from the Far East, from the Amur region, to places in central Russia. And, well, there's no doubt at all that the Russians suffered damage. And the way it has been described is that the Ukrainians managed to launch around 117 FPV drones at these Russian bases and attempted to penetrate those bases. The Ukrainians implied that all of the bases were struck. The Russians give a different story. The Russian Defense Ministry has provided a report which is short and succinct, and it's the one I'm going to read now. Today, this is a report that was published yesterday, the Kiev regime carried out a terrorist attack using FPV drones against airfields in Murmansk, Irkutsk, Ivanovo, Ryazan, and Amur regions. So Murmansk is beyond the Arctic Circle. It is in the far north of Russia. Irkutsk is in Siberia. This is the air base, the attack upon which has received by far the heaviest media attention, and it is the only air base so far of which I know that satellite photos have been provided of the attack, of the effects of the attack. Ivanovo, which is in central Russia, Ryazan, which is in central Russia, and Amur regions. Amur region is in the far east of Russia, near the Pacific Ocean. All terrorist attacks were repelled at military airfields in Ivanovo, Ryazan, and Amur regions. So the attacks on the air bases in central Russia, in Ivanovo and Ryazan, were unsuccessful, as was the attack, or rather, I should say, attempted attack on the air base in the Amur region in the Far East. In Murmansk and in Irkutsk region, as a result of FPV drones launched from an area in close proximity to the airfields, several aircraft caught fire. The Russian Defense Ministry has not said so far how many, but there are some indications, and we will discuss those in a moment. The fire was brought under control. There were no casualties among military and civilian personnel. And then, importantly, the last comment, some participants of the terrorist attacks were detained. Now, I will quickly say that whatever these attacks were, I would not personally and myself call them or describe them as terrorist attacks. They were attacks on military bases. Ukraine is involved in an armed conflict with Russia. As far as I'm concerned, as these were air bases, these were legitimate targets. And the Ukrainians and Zelensky are cock-a-hoop about what happened, and they're providing their own very elaborate and detailed accounts. They're saying that the attack was organized by the SBU, the Ukrainian Intelligence and Counterintelligence Service, so not by Kirill Budanov's military intelligence. The attack was prepared over 18 months. So if that is correct, then that means that the attack, the preparations for the attack began in the late autumn or early winter or early winter of 2023, November, December 2023, shortly after, in other words, the failure of Ukraine's summer 2023 offensive, and perhaps immediately prior to the fall of Avdiivka. Zelensky himself apparently supervised the attack, though the director of the SBU was himself personally involved. And according to the Ukrainians smuggled small helicopter drones, one of these very small FPV drones, into Russia over a prolonged period, using networks of agents that they had in Russia. And then they also smuggled in certain automated wooden containers into Russia, into which these drones, the production of which, the fabrication of which was completed in some way inside Russia. Anyway, these drones were hidden in these containers. The containers were moved to the air bases on trucks at a moment, at a particular moment, at a coordinated moment. The containers opened automatically. The drones were launched. The drones were coordinated. The attack of the drones was coordinated by FPV controllers in Ukraine itself. And these drones then attacked the 5 air bases. And Ukraine has made different claims about the number of aircraft it says were destroyed. Yesterday, in the hours immediately after the attack, they were claiming that up to 40 aircraft were destroyed, including large numbers of Tupolev 95 and Tupolev 22M3 bombers. And later today, I noticed that the number has been reduced quietly to 17. I think the probable figure is significantly below that for reasons I will discuss shortly. And the Ukrainians have provided some drone footage of the attack, and this appears to be almost entirely drone footage of the attack on the airfield in Irkutsk. Just saying. Now, the Russians have not provided any official account of this attack, at least not so far. Apparently, either yesterday or today, there was or is going to be a meeting of the Russian Security Council where Vladimir Putin himself will be briefed on this attack, and we might get more details of this attack when that meeting of the Security Council takes place. It is not impossible that the Kremlin will have provided its account by the time you're watching this video. But I have not got that account yet, so obviously I am guessing, or at least not guessing exactly, but I'm putting together my understanding of what happened from incomplete information, where the gaps might have already been filled by the time this video appears. I'm afraid this happens rather a lot for programs like this. There is nothing I can do about that. I don't have prophetic abilities, no matter what some people say. So I cannot anticipate more information that the Russians might be providing over the course of the day, and which might be available to you by the time you're watching this program. Anyway, Russian accounts, and these are not official Russian accounts, but discussions that have been taking place on the various Telegram channels, some of which appear to be based on information which may have been leaked by official sources, suggest a somewhat different account of events than the ones that the Ukrainians have been providing. The overall picture is the same. Small FPV drones brought close to the air bases in trucks, inside containers, the containers opening automatically and launching the drones, and the drones carrying out attacks on the air bases. But Russian accounts suggest that far from being smuggled into Russia in the way that the Ukrainians are saying, the drones and the containers were actually manufactured inside Russia itself using various off-the-shelf components. The Russians are also clear that suggestions that have appeared in Ukraine that some kind of AI technology was used in the attack is untrue, that the attack was conducted by manually guided FPV drones. In other words, there were drone operators. In fact, the Ukrainians have admitted that there were drone operators, one for each drone apparently. So that means 117 drone operators in total. And there was no AI technology used at all, according to the Russians. And it's been suggested that the Ukrainians were able to communicate with their drones by piggybacking off certain Russian telephone networks, mobile phone networks. Anyway, that's what the Russians are saying. And as we've seen, the Russian Defense Ministry says that some of the people who were involved in these attacks have been captured. Now, there's been, again, more information which has been provided by some Russian telegram channels over and above this. There's claims that some of the drivers of the trucks that were carrying the containers did not know the nature of what they were carrying. There's claims that one driver became suspicious and sought to examine one of the containers, and that the container exploded, presumably through some kind of automatic device, or perhaps the Ukrainians were able to keep track of what was happening and noticed that there was somebody trying to examine what was inside one of the containers, and they exploded the container remotely. There was reports, rather grisly reports yesterday, that said that one of the drivers, specifically the driver of the truck carrying the container that was used to carry out the attack on the base in Irkutsk, that he was strangled. Now, if so, that would mean that he was murdered by Ukrainian operatives, which would suggest that would have been a grisly murder. And for the record, I would say that was, in my opinion, a terrorist incident, even if the attacks on the bases arguably were not. The driver, obviously, was not a military person, a military target. He was simply murdered because he was inconvenient and he was there. But I'm not absolutely sure that this murder even happened, and perhaps we should wait and see until, as I said, we get more information. So this is what the Russians are saying. They're saying that in other cases there was other attempts by civilians to interfere with the drone attacks, and that this impeded the drone attacks as well. Again, it's difficult to get a complete understanding of all of this until we hear a full Russian account of what did exactly happen. I'm not saying these reports are untrue, by the way. I'm just saying that we should wait until we get an official account, and that will provide us with a more clear narrative of exactly what took place. So, a very complicated attack indeed by the Ukrainians, but one which achieved a certain degree of success. Even if 3 of the bases suffered no damage, 2 did, and it does seem that at least some aircraft were destroyed. The Russian Defense Ministry says that there was fires in 2 of these bases, that aircraft caught fire in 2 of these bases. And satellite pictures have now been provided of the base at Irkutsk, which, judging from the fact that it is the base from which the Ukrainians have provided the most drone footage, by far the most drone footage, may have been the base which suffered the greatest damage. Anyway, this satellite footage suggests an attack on perhaps 3 or 4 Tupolev 95 bombers. It suggested that 3 of them were destroyed completely. 1 of them was damaged, but possibly could be repaired, and that another bomber, a Tupolev 22 M3, was also destroyed. So certainly not 40 aircraft, apparently, at least not at this base, maybe 5 in total, of which 4 were destroyed outright, but 1 is perhaps capable of repair. Now, let's first of all discuss the extent of the damage and whether this has really created a major problem for the Russians, as the Ukrainians appear to be claiming to themselves. I think these Ukrainian claims are based on claims that up to 40 bombers, Russian bombers, heavy bombers, might have been destroyed. Now, according to some claims, Russia operates a fleet of perhaps 50 to 60, I've seen some claims it's 55, Tupolev 95 bombers. And I believe that the total force of Tupolev 22 M3s is perhaps around 30 to 40, though again, it's difficult to get exact numbers. If 40 bombers have been destroyed, or if 17 bombers had been destroyed, well, it would be a significant damage to Russia's existing strategic bomber force. But we see that the attack on Irkutsk suggests 5 bombers destroyed there, or at least 4 bombers destroyed there, and 1 seriously damaged. We don't yet have any footage, satellite footage, confirming the damage at the airfield in Murmansk. It might be more, or it might be less, but the fact that the Ukrainians have provided, as far as I'm aware, no drone footage from that particular airbase, that might suggest that the damage there was less than at the airfield in Irkutsk. So, if we're talking about, say, 7 bombers altogether, then that would account for a significant number of bombers, but far from enough to call into question the viability of Russia's strategic aviation, its bomber force. Now, at this point, I think something does need to be said about the state of Russia's bomber force and what role it plays in Russia's strategic triad. And that is to say it straightforwardly, it is by far the weakest part of Russia's strategic triad. Russia's ground-launched intercontinental ballistic missiles are arguably by far the most important part of Russia's strategic triad. Here, the United States is very different from Russia is very different from the United States, where land-based intercontinental ballistic missiles play a much smaller part in the US's strategic forces. In Russia, as I said, land-based missiles are by far the most important part of it. Some of them are silo-based, like the famous or infamous Satan missiles, the most powerful ICBMs in existence, the ones that are going to be replaced over time with the new Sarmat intercontinental ballistic missile, which is now entering service. But of course, there are the various road mobile ICBMs like the Topol and the Yars, which Russia fields in extensive numbers. These are extremely modern and very powerful weapons, and the Russians, as I said, have these in significant quantities. Russia also, like the United States, has prioritized sea-based intercontinental ballistic missiles. And here again, one has to say that the Russian strategic forces that are sea-based are modern and arguably, if this is the right expression, in rude health, perhaps in better shape than the American ones are, which rely on the Trident missiles, which have iterations going back to the 1970s. Anyway, the Borei class nuclear submarines are entering service in steady and ever increasing numbers. They carry the extremely advanced Bulava missile, which, as I said, is perhaps the most advanced sea-launched ballistic missile in the world. And there are still some of the older Soviet-era submarines in service, and they carry also what is in fact quite a modern system called the Sineva, which is also a very advanced missile indeed. Now, the strategic bomber force, by contrast, has been the most heavily and deeply neglected part of Russia's strategic triad. Russia has no stealth bombers. It does have a small number of supersonic, intercontinental, extremely advanced, but non-stealthy bombers, the Tupolev 160s, of which it seems none were affected by this latest attack. The Tupolev 22M3s that people have been talking about are not intercontinental in range. They are medium bombers. They're very powerful systems. They're supersonic. They're used by Russia, have been used by Russia extensively in places like Syria and such places, but they are not advanced, not remotely as advanced as the Tupolev 160s. And the Tupolev 160s, to repeat again, are supersonic bombers. They are not comparable to the American stealth bombers, the B-2 and the B-21, which is now entering service. And if we're talking about the Tupolev 160s, I understand that Russia has around 10 of them. So this is not a big force at all. Most of the Russian strategic aviation force is made up of Tupolev 95s. Now, this is the Russian equivalent of the American B-52 bomber. Like the B-52, it is subsonic. Like the B-52, it dates from the early 1950s. It was, in fact, authorized for production by none other than the Soviet leader, the wartime Second World War Soviet leader, Joseph Stalin. And apparently the first Tupolev 95 flew whilst he was still alive and still leading the Soviet Union as long ago as 1952. And unlike the B-52s, these are propeller-driven aircraft. Now that may make them appear more archaic than they actually in fact are. These engines, these propeller engines, are actually some of the earliest and still by far the most powerful turboprop engines ever built. They're huge engines, and they propel this aircraft, if I can put it like that, at high subsonic speeds, and the tips of the propellers, the rotors, actually move at supersonic speeds. So, it is in some ways an engineering marvel of the early 1950s. However, these aircraft are extremely noisy. They operate at high altitudes, but not as high as the B-52s. And though they have incredible intercontinental range, as I said, it's debatable, or I should say it is debatable whether they could penetrate modern air defenses, or, by the way, even air defenses of the sort that existed when they entered service in the 1950s. The Russians used these aircraft as basically trucks for long-range cruise missiles, the KH-101s. And the KH-101s come in two forms. One, which is the conventionally the one with a conventional warhead, the one that has been used heavily in Ukraine, and the KH-102, which has a nuclear warhead. And these bombers would not be expected to penetrate to places where air defenses exist, because, as I said, they would be easily shot down if they tried. They are very long-range standoff bombers, which would launch cruise missiles. One assumes from Russian or Russian-controlled territory at an adversary. And, of course, that already limits their capabilities. They're not able to penetrate hostile airspace in the way that the B-2s rather, and the B-21s of the US Air Force and the Tupolev 160s of the Russian Air Force are intended to do. So this branch of the Russian military is in serious need of updating, and in fact there are plans to update it. There are already plans to resume production of the Tupolev 160, production of which was interrupted during the late Soviet, as a result of the Soviet collapse. Supposedly 50 are intended for production, and there are constant reports and claims and reports that the Russians are themselves working on a subsonic stealth bomber of their own, though no actual pictures have ever appeared of such an aircraft, and whether it exists or not, I'm not going to start debating over the course of this program. So, as I said, this part of Russia's strategic triad is the weakest, least advanced part. It's the one that has been the least modernized. There's been much debate inside Russia, by the way, about whether bombers, even stealth bombers, are really effective against modern air defenses, and whether it makes any sense to invest further funds in procuring bombers. Anyway, I'm not going to get into those discussions either. So when people have been writing about whether this particular attack is going to affect Russia's capabilities as a nuclear power, the answer is only very slightly. This would be so even if the higher number of, say, 17 bombers destroyed were to turn out to be true, and I suspect it is significantly less than this. So that is one thing to say. Secondly, in terms of Russian capabilities in the war in Ukraine, well, the short answer again is that it's not going to make any significant difference. The Russians have never launched 20 or 30 or 40 bombers at Ukraine, Tupolev 95 bombers at Ukraine at any one time, launching missiles against Ukraine. It's likely, as to my best of my memory, the total number of Tupolev 95 bombers who have conducted strikes against Ukraine have never numbered more than about 6. And nobody doubts that Russia still has that number of Tupolev 95 bombers. So there's been no reduction of capability there. What this incident has done, however, is again, it has provided Ukraine with a demonstration of its ability to strike at targets, one would assume severely protected targets inside Russia itself, and moreover to cause real damage to the Russians in those kind of attacks. And to say that this is embarrassing and even humiliating for the Russians, given that, as I said, we are talking about a part of their strategic triad, that would be perhaps even an understatement. But we have to ask this question again. What concretely in terms of its own survival, its battle for survival, has Ukraine actually achieved? It's not reduced Russian capabilities in terms of Russia's ability to conduct the war against Ukraine. It has barely dented Russia's abilities as a nuclear power. There's been suggestions that the damage done might in some way have affected Russia's ability to project power beyond its borders. I can't see how. I mean, one wouldn't use Tupolev 95s, creaking old machines designed in the 1950s for something like that. I mean, one would use more advanced warships and things of that kind in order to do that. So what exactly has Ukraine achieved by this attack, other than to upset, embarrass, humiliate the Russians, if that is the right word? I can't really see anything. And we can perhaps also see things that Ukraine might have actually lost. This operation took 18 months to prepare. It's almost certain that established networks of Ukrainian agents have been compromised within Russia through the carrying out of this attack. Several participants in the attack, according to the Russians, have been captured. It's likely that the Ukrainians have worked very hard and very long, probably since the Maidan coup of 2014, perhaps since long before then, maybe from right back to the time of the Orange Revolution in 2004, when Ukraine first began to align itself with the West. Ukraine has worked very, very hard to establish networks of agents inside Russia. And this operation, huge and complex as it was, will have required the work of lots of agents. And as I said, they've now been compromised. So it's likely that, as I said, agent networks have been compromised as well. It's not as if this operation can be easily replayed if it took 18 months to organize. The Russians will, of course, be taking precautions in future. It's been suggested that, obviously, by the way, the suggestion that they should create shelters for these enormous bombers is borderline, fanciful, but they can provide netting to protect them from FPV drones and that kind of thing, and no doubt things like this will start to happen before long. So it's unlikely that the Ukrainians are going to be able to conduct an operation like this again. And as I said, this operation has achieved, in practical terms, it seems to me, very little. If it is assumed that this is going to shock the Russians into changing their policies in the Ukraine war, then I think that this is completely wrong. It completely misunderstands the toughness and resolution of the Russian political leadership. Just repeat again, I was in Russia at the time of the Beslan affair, back in, I think it was 2004, when a school was captured by jihadi terrorists in the Caucasus, and a lot of the children were killed. I was in Moscow when bombs were being exploded in the Moscow metro, and when there were reports that airplanes, civil aircraft, were being blown up in the sky with the passengers in them. And I remember being absolutely astonished at the way in which this country had the ability to just keep going and not be deflected. This is true, by the way, of the population as well as of the government. And, it didn't change anything in terms of the policies that the Russians were conducting at that time in the Caucasus. And I don't think this is going to affect in any way Russian policy, military or political or diplomatic policy in the conflict in Ukraine. I don't think, for example, it's going to make the Russians intensify the war. I don't think it's going to make any difference to Russian strategic planning at any level whatsoever. So as I said, I think if that was the plan, if that was the intention, then already this shows a basic miscalculation of the way in which the Russians get about doing things. So to me, this operation has that quality of many similar operations conducted by the British against the Germans during the Second World War. Operations like the Cockleshell Heroes, the destruction of the dams in the Ruhr, the various operations that were carried out by the Special Air Service at that time. The British, during the Second World War, when they had few other means to hit back at the Germans, involved themselves in many, many operations like this, sinking the Tirpitz battleship and all of that. I think today, looking back on all of these operations, the overwhelming consensus amongst military historians is that none of these operations made the slightest difference in the outcome of the war at all. It's unlikely that the German political leadership was even particularly interested or briefed in any detail about them. These operations made a difference to British morale. They resulted in an series of rather good films that appeared in Britain in the 1950s. But in fact, and in reality, these sabotage missions conducted by the British during the Second World War made no difference to the outcome of the war at all. And I predict that this is the same, and I further predict that we will probably one day find that the British, who remain addicted to this sort of thing, were probably involved in the planning and execution of this operation also in some sort of way. Anyway, to reiterate, it is likely that we will have more information about this attack over the course of the next 24 hours. It's quite likely that we will get a briefing and a report to Putin at the Security Council meeting, which is probably already happening or may already have happened. We might get a readout about it from the Kremlin. And if this information causes me to revise my views, the views that I have set out in this program, then obviously I will discuss that information, and I will explain why I have revised my views in the next program. But anyway, this is what I think about this episode as of today. An incident, an episode which is a tactical victory for the Ukrainians, certainly. One which has embarrassed and at some level humiliated the Russians. One which is inevitably going to lead to serious questions in Russia being asked about why there continue to be these failures in security around key strategic assets like air bases. Ones which, by the way, are going to result in criticism of Putin. Criticism that he is far too lax and tolerant of senior officials who fail repeatedly in these matters, but one which, to reiterate again, does not ultimately change the strategic picture, the balance of forces between Russia and the United States, and one which also does not change the course of the war in any way at all. Now, before I finish with the topic of the attacks, the drone attacks, I said, perhaps controversially for some people, that I don't myself classify these drone attacks on the air bases as terrorist attacks, though if the driver of one of the vehicles that placed one of those containers near the airbase was murdered, that, in my opinion, would be a terrorist attack. I should say that I have absolutely no hesitation whatsoever in classifying the attacks on at least one of the railway bridges as a terrorist attack. It appears to have been timed remotely, or rather, it appears to have been conducted remotely in order to hit a passenger train. If, as seems almost certainly the case, the attack was deliberately done in order to hurt or injure or kill people in that passenger train, and it seems several children were caught up in that attack, then that was definitely a terrorist attack and ought to be treated and described in that way. Of course, as night follows day, no one in the media in the West is going to speak about it in that fashion. Now, there is swirling debate and controversy about what the United States government and what Donald Trump himself knew about this drone attack that was carried out on the air bases. Just to make it clear again, to some extent, this is a bit of a red herring. An attack like this could not have been conducted by Ukraine based on its own resources, even though Ukrainian networks of agents were obviously involved in this. Ultimately, this was an attack which must have been coordinated with Western intelligence agencies at some level. Now, to repeat again, this is not going to change the outcome of the war, and in fact, importantly, over the last 24 hours, there have been further very important military advances by the Russians across the battlefronts. But perhaps the most interesting development in a kind of a way, the one that points most clearly to the direction the war is taking, is the sudden announcement of the resignation of the commander of Ukraine's land forces, General Drapati. Now, General Drapati has given a reason for his resignation. He says that he bears responsibility for the fact that the Russians were able to conduct a successful missile strike on a Ukrainian training base. He says that in any military system, the senior commanders must take responsibility, and for that reason, he is stepping down. I have to say, I don't believe a word of it. I don't believe that there is any conceivable way in which General Drapati or any other Ukrainian officers in an army that have never shown much sense of responsibility for military defeats or setbacks or for losses of men or material or anything of that kind, I can't imagine that General Drapati really resigned for that reason. He is the commander of Ukraine ground forces. He is the commander of an army that is about to face a colossal Russian offensive. Military duty, I would have thought, would require him to stay at his post in this moment of crisis, both for the army he commands and for the nation he serves. I think General Drapati has resigned because he can see that the war is being lost and he wants to bail out first. He doesn't want to be held responsible for the inevitable military defeat the Ukrainian armed forces are going to suffer over the next couple of months as the Russian military offensive unfolds. Meanwhile, the Ukrainians and the Russians are meeting in Istanbul. As I said right at the outset of this program, the Ukrainians, after giving everybody reasons to think that they might not be coming to Istanbul, of course, turned up. After all, the Ukrainians are there. They will therefore receive the Russian memorandum. As I discussed in my program yesterday, Vasily Nebenzia, the Russian ambassador at the UN, gave a powerful speech in which he made it absolutely clear that the Russians are not moderating their positions by any degree. The memorandum that they will present to the Ukrainians will set out all the same points that the Russians have already previously made, Istanbul Plus and all of that. And the Russians are already also going to give the Ukrainians a document in which they're going to reject the Ukrainian proposals for a ceasefire. Now, we've actually heard more about these proposals, and the proposals about a ceasefire, so far as I understand that the Ukrainians are providing, are pretty sketchy. Overall, they don't really provide any impartial enforcement mechanisms or anything of that kind. They do, however, apparently talk about a frozen conflict along the existing conflict line. They also say that there will be no recognition of any territory currently occupied by the Russians as Russian. They also apparently speak about the Russians paying reparations to Ukraine. And they also say that the Ukrainians must have the right to build up their armed forces to whatever level and whatever degree that they choose. There is no conceivable way that the Russians are going to accept those proposals. So it looks to me as if we will probably have another meeting in Istanbul. It'll be interesting to see how long this one lasts, but I cannot imagine that it will result in any progress being made at all. So there we are. We are probably, as I discussed in my program yesterday, coming to the point of decision. The United States, hoping perhaps that there will be some give either from the Ukrainians or more plausibly from the Russians, but disappointed by the drone offensive that Ukraine has carried out. Maybe there's still hopes that this drone attack on the air bases is going to change Russian behavior, but as I've said already, those hopes are going to be dashed. Maybe there's hopes that the Taurus missiles, if they're ever launched at Russia, are going to change the Russian calculus, but of course they're not going to. So at some point, the Americans will have to make the choice. They will have to decide what to do. All the indications are that Donald Trump ultimately intends to pull away. He apparently does not want to continue to be involved in the war. And as I discussed 2 programs ago, General Kellogg says that it's all going to be passed over to the Europeans. That looks to be today the most likely outcome. Of course, things can go unexpectedly. It may be that something happens in Istanbul which is unforeseen by me. Maybe Putin has had some unexplained and incomprehensible change of heart and is prepared to make compromises and make concessions which he has never shown the slightest indication of wanting to do. I don't believe that for 1 second, but by tomorrow we will know. And tomorrow will be when I do my next program. And this is where I finish today's program. So let me remind you again, you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble and X. You can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar and by going to our shop. Links under this video. Last but not least, if you've liked this video, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day.